Hey everybody, welcome to Mossback, the official podcast of the Mossback's Northwest video series from Cascade PBS. I'm Stephen Hegg.
And I'm Knut Berger.
And today, we're talking about one Seattle educator and her deep love of birds.
Okay, that was a junco. There's a little flock that went into a tree. See right down there?
In the early 1900s, Adelaide Lowry Pollock was the first female principal of Seattle Public Schools, and she made it her mission to incorporate birding into almost everything she did, both in and out of the classroom.
She really saw them as little feathered people. You know, she called them feathered citizens.
If you haven't already seen the video, you might take a few moments to watch it. It'll make this conversation more interesting and more relevant. You can find the video in the show notes, but for now, take a perch and listen up.
There's someone singing over there. There's a lot of bird activity.
Knut, are you a birder?
I consider myself a birding ally. They're small and flitty. Can be hard to pick out visually sometimes. I'm not a person who goes out and has a checklist and tries to hunt down birds. But every time I take a walk or I live in an apartment that is adjacent to a lot of different kinds of birds, we have eagles and ospreys and all kinds of ducks and stuff. So it's just kind of incorporated into my daily life. I carry binoculars with me whenever I'm going to Seward Park and whatnot. Here's a little guy in that tree. So I love to look for birds, but I'm not collecting them.
Where are you looking?
Oh, I see. Yeah.
It sounds like you're a little wary of the geekiness that the term birder implies. And I say that with all due respect for birders, but the birders I know are supreme geeks.
There are two other warblers that look like a thrush, though, and unlike the ovenbird, they have thrush in their name.
There's a lot to know, there's a lot to categorize, and there are a lot of opinions.
We decided to push the idea of competition in birding to the next level by creating a birding tournament.
Yeah, no, I'm not one of those. I benefit from those who are because I buy bird books and look up birds online. I have Merlin, which is an app on my phone that can tell you what the bird noise is, who's singing. And so it's instead of bird watching, it's sort of you go out bird hearing. So I benefit from the bird nerds. But I remember I had a friend whose father was a very well-known stamp dealer and collector. He came to town and I said, well, gee, my dad used to collect stamps. He has a big collection. Would you like to look at it? And so I invited him to look at the material, and he just looked at me with a sense of deep disappointment. He said, your father was not a stamp collector. He was what we call an accumulator. And, and that's the difference, I think, between me and a birder. I'm an accumulator, not a collector.
Well, speaking of geeky birders, you did a deep dive recently into one of the most dedicated birders in Seattle history, and that's Adelaide Lowry Pollock. How did you discover Pollock? Who was she?
Well, I discovered her while doing research, not about her, but about a photograph that was taken by Aishel Curtis. And we're working with the Washington State Historical Society, and they're scanning many previously unscanned images by Curtis. And I've been writing about some of them. And there was one image that came up early on that I was really fascinated by. It was taken about 1905, 1906, and it's a picture of a bunch of school children sitting on a bank, and they're holding birdhouses of all kinds. Obviously, like a class project, everybody had to make a birdhouse. And I was really intrigued, like, why are these kids making birdhouses? And so I began kind of doing some research and looking where other schools making birdhouses. Anyway, it all kind of led me to Queen Anne Elementary School.
That's where the kids were?
Yeah. And it turned out that the principal of Queen Anne Elementary School at that time was a woman named Adelaide Lowry Pollock. It turns out she was the first woman who was principal of a graded school in Seattle history. And she was an avid birder. And she had written a couple books about birds. And looking at additional photographs, we found that they were teaching classes about birds. I found newspaper references to classes from the school going bird watching at different places and recording birds. And so I became fascinated by this teacher who seemed to have a bird curriculum that she was teaching at this grade school.
Where did she take her students to watch birds?
Well, there's another Aishel Curtis photograph of a bird classroom. So these students are in the class learning about birds. On the wall is a map that the students have made of where birds' nests have been found. And it's basically a map of the top of Queen Anne Hill. And you can see there is code, and here's where a robin's nest was found, or here's where, a chickadee's nest was found, various things. So these kids are going out, and you can see by the stuff that's written on the blackboard and whatnot that they're studying bird behavior, not just bird names, bird songs. They're studying bird poetry. They're learning about their nesting habits, their migration habits. It's serious, get to know your bird neighbors. So initially, anyway, these kids were being taken on loops around Queen Anne Hill. So on the map was Mount Pleasant Cemetery. And it's, an old 19th century to current day cemetery on the north end of Queen Anne Hill. And I saw in the newspaper that a class from Queen Anne Elementary School, then called West Queen Anne Elementary School, just to distinguish it, that a class from there had gone bird watching in the cemetery.
The more you know about birds, the more you realize you don't know about birds.
Yeah.
It's just never ending. So we had to go up there to Mount Pleasant Cemetery, which is a beautiful, peaceful place to try to see and hear perhaps the birds that Pollock and her students saw and heard.
What do we have there? They're invisible in the tree now.
How do you think the Mount Pleasant Cemetery that we visited is the same or different from the Mount Pleasant Cemetery that Pollock and her students visited?
Well, it's remarkably quiet. There are a lot more people buried in that cemetery now than there were back then. 60,000 estimated graves here.
But there are some very old graves. It's a window into old Northwest.
That's right. It has pioneer people buried there. The cemetery was started small in the 1870s and has grown. And there's a Jewish cemetery there, a Chinese cemetery, but also very contemporary graves as well. So but it has some spectacular big trees. On the map, there's kind of a landmark tree, and that's it right there. It has giant sequoias, giant cedars, some big Doug firs. We don't have the old cemeteries like New England, but this has a lot of that kind of character combined with what turns out to be still some pretty good bird habitat.
Are there any birds that Adelaide Pollock and her school kids would have seen that would never be seen by people like us today?
Well, that's really interesting because many of the birds are the same. But the one bird I noticed, because they don't live in Seattle anymore, but in Adelaide Pollock's day, early 20th century, Seattle had bluebirds, western bluebirds. Now to see a western bluebird, you pretty much have to go to eastern Washington, up on the Bickleton Plateau or someplace like that to see bluebirds. But in Pollock's day, western bluebirds were nesting, on Queen Anne Hill and in West Seattle and various places.
Did she have logs of their trips, or did the children leave logs of their trips and of the birds that they encountered?
Yeah, they mapped them in the classroom. They kept track. That was part of it. And she would take campfire girls, or she would go to summer camps in the summer and give bird classes, or she would take people to Mount Rainier and they'd go hiking and they'd look for birds. And, birds were, I think, something that she found connected her with nature. The acuity that you need to kind of pay attention to what is the bird doing? Where is it doing it? What kind of bird is it? What cycle is it in? The things that you think of as bird nerd stuff, she saw as connecting people with nature. And at the time she was active at West Queen Anne Elementary, this was a time of great growth in Seattle. This is a time when the city is urbanizing. We're talking about time between 1900 and World War I. That period, many ethnic groups are coming in, land is being developed. Interbay, which is right adjacent to Queen Anne Hill, was cattle farms, and but a lot of people were moving in. And I think she was afraid that nature was going to be pushed out of the city in a way that had happened in the East Coast. That as the population grew on the East Coast, you saw fewer and fewer types of birds. She didn't want that to happen in Seattle. So it was almost a measure of our kind of environmental awareness to understand these birds, and if you could, to kind of cultivate them.
Why do birds need human-built birdhouses? The concept is strange to me. I would think that a bird would have particular wants and needs and find that in a natural habitat. So I'm wondering what Pollock's instructions to the kids were about what they were building.
Well, we don't know what the instructions to the kids were exactly. If you look at the picture, you can see that these houses run every sort of gamut of like a typical old Seattle neighborhood. There's, log cabin style bird houses. There are ones that look like the classic Seattle box houses. There are ones that look like little bungalows.
Are there any Victorian mansion birdhouses?
Not quite, but there's some that could be mansion size. So I don't know exactly what she was teaching her students, except to be careful observers of birds and their nesting habits, which are pretty crucial because the birdhouses are essentially places where they can build nests. And Pollock wrote some of her ideas down in a book that she published later after her school years. She wrote a couple of books about Northwest birds. So she wrote a book called Excursions About Birdland from the Rockies to the Pacific. And in that book, she has a chapter which addresses birdhouses. So let me read part of that to you. Out where the West begins, birds may choose to be near man through all the year, yet he must provide attractions to help them increase, or his region will be in the same plight as the long-settled states where birds are decreasing in number. There was a time in the East when but 4 species of wild birds would live in man-made houses. Most men and women who grew up on farms know these birds to be the tree swallow, the purple martin, the house wren, and the bluebird. But as increase in population has made harder conditions for them, other birds have learned to accept ready-made houses. So there's a suggestion that urbanization of some point is displacing birds and creating a market for artificial habitats, basically, human-created. And we do that today, not necessarily building birdhouses, but we do that with plantings that are supposed to be bird-friendly or going to help attract hummingbirds, or, designing yards so that birds want to come there.
Is there a bird around here anyway that could be more abundant, plentiful if there were birdhouses?
Well, let me read one more paragraph. If the right kinds of locations and attractive dwellings are provided, the western winter wren, the Seattle wren, which we call a Bewick's wren now, but Seattle wren, the northern violet-green swallow, the flicker, the chickadee, the phoebe, the western flycatcher, and even the white-breasted nuthatch may be coaxed in the lucky localities where they are found into birdhouses. Even western robins and rusty song sparrows will sometimes accept roofed shelters with one or all sides open so the birds may feel that freedom that is theirs to enjoy when they want it. So, she's basically designing bird neighborhoods. There's a housing shortage for birds, so we're going to address it. And this accompanies in the book a chart on how to build birdhouses for these specific species. So they have to do with how far up they are, how far off the ground, how wide the floor is or what the square footage is, the depth of the cavity, because some birds want a shallower one than others, how the entrance should be placed, and the diameter of that entrance. So she's looked at birds very carefully. She's read literature about how you build birdhouses and why, and she's offering this instruction to the people of Seattle.
I wonder what Adelaide Pollock, what else she was teaching her kids, and did she use birding as a method to teach the kids about the world in other ways?
She absolutely did. It's really clear that one of the stated purposes of public education was to create good citizens. I mean, you have all these people moving in, you have a lot of immigrants, and the idea was that schools are where we teach people reading, writing, arithmetic, in her case, birding. But the objective is to create better citizens, and that somehow studying birds in the city makes you learn more about your own habitat. It also helps you build relations with others. And to me, that was one of the key things that got me interested, was this way in which she saw that the discipline of learning about birds and cultivating birds, building houses for birds, would make people better citizens, would make the city a better place for good citizens.
So she was very civic-minded.
Yes, incredibly so. And this reflects in her career at the school. I found in the newspaper, this is from 1916, so we're just prior to World War I, or America's involvement in World War I. And it says, this article from the Seattle Times says, pupils of the 7th and 8th grades of West Queen Anne Public School, of which Miss Adelaide Pollock is principal, have evolved a civic pledge which has been adopted by the school as its motto. Many of the pupils wrote pledges, and one finally adopted is a composite of all of those submitted. And here it is, quote, "I am a citizen of Seattle. I pledge allegiance to my school and to my city and all the purposes that will help uphold and preserve them. I will do nothing to dishonor our city or degrade her people, but I will obey the laws made by wise men and women. I will try to make this city a home of health, beauty, and happiness. I will always place the interests of my school, community, and city before any personal desires. This is true citizenship to which I pledge my heart and hand."
Wow. It's unlikely that any group of people would ever agree on a pledge of any kind, let alone that one.
Well, I think this was at a time when the Seattle public schools were growing rapidly and were dealing with this changing city. This was no longer one-room schoolhouses. This was major city growing fast. And it was also a period of kind of an eruption of patriotism, particularly as you get close to World War I. So this idea of a loyalty oath, the Pledge of Allegiance emerged at this time. So this idea that you had to publicly commit to bettering your place, and teachers were hired in part because they embodied the establishment that was the order. She talks about the wise men and women. Well, that's interesting. One, she included women. That's a little unusual. Two, she's basically saying there are people who know more than you do, and you must respect their opinion. And the teachers that were hired, especially the female teachers, had to be single. They had to be white, preferably Protestant. This is a period of the kind of white Anglo-Saxon dominance and pushing that forward as the established social order that you need to assimilate to.
Why did women teachers have to be single? I'm gathering that male teachers did not have to be single.
Male teachers did not have to be single. Male teachers got paid more. Male teachers were running the school districts. You know, the first superintendent of public schools in the one-room schoolhouse days was a woman. But when it came to this sort of, okay, we're serious now, we're building these huge schools, these big edifices. You know, you look at the old schools of that era, and they're like banks used to be. I mean, this is an institution meant to be respected. And so I think the idea was that the women teachers could come and they could devote themselves fully to teaching, but the minute they had family, or the minute they were at risk of having family because they were married and would get pregnant and have children, then her duty was on the home front. So there were a lot of single women teachers in Seattle schools at that time. It was a growing thing.
Did she stay in Seattle schools her whole life?
No, she didn't, although she stayed engaged with the school system in one way or the other for a long time. But in 1918, she signed up and went to Europe for the war effort. She worked for the Army, she worked for the YMCA, and she went over there to instruct young soldiers in citizenship. And you can imagine the military has recruited, they've drafted and recruited all these young men from all over the country, all walks of life. They've sent them to Europe. And particularly when the war was sort of winding down for Americans, and after the war, when you have tens of thousands of these young men waiting for a ship home, people like Pollock came in and provided education. They were taught about citizenship. They were taught about history. They had self-improvement classes, and she went over and did that. She spent a couple of years doing that. When she came back, she did not go back into the school district, but she threw herself into sort of the women's club movement. She was very involved. She founded a national organization for women school or educational administrators. She also got really involved in creating a retirement home for retired teachers because teachers did not have pensions. They were paid less than men, and they were single, most of them. So when they retired, they didn't necessarily have support. And so she created a place where those folks could go, and it evolved eventually into what we know as Ida Culver House, which is a retirement community. There are Ida Culver houses around the city, and she herself lived there in the last years of her life.
She reminds me of some of the other women that we've discussed on the podcast and in the series. These people who worked so hard, devoted their lives to making society better.
Yeah, it's interesting. She, outside of education, when she came back from the war, she devoted herself to a number of causes. She was on the Seattle Planning Commission at one point. She was involved with the Seattle Women's Federation. Seattle was developing a new charter. She weighed in on that. I found a thing from the 1920s, I think 1925, where religious and educational workers were demanding that Seattle jails be improved when it came to young people. And, you know, Adelaide Pollock never gave up on working with young people. Her books were aimed at young people. She was taking them to, you know, Mount Rainier and other places to enjoy the outdoors and bird on the side. And this was interesting because I didn't know about this until recently. She's describing her trip to the city jail. Miss Adelaide Pollock, a teacher in the public school, said she saw derelicts crowded in a tank in the city jail without chairs, beds, facilities to keep themselves clean. Youthful offenders of both sexes were mingled with the hardened characters, no efforts being made, she said, to segregate the prisoners so that youth would be saved from contact with men and women wise in immorality and crime. Ms. Pollock said she took the matter up with Mayor E.J. Brown, asking that the facilities for housing city prisoners be improved, but was told that shortage of funds prevented betterments which were recognized as badly needed.
One could easily think that her life was very pristine. Oh, she's out birding. She's, watching birds and building birdhouses and even being an elementary school teacher. But her life involved some of the most difficult aspects of society. She was observing some of the worst that was happening at the time as well.
Yeah, and I think she felt a responsibility toward it, toward improving it in terms of, making those changes. Now, she's operating with the disadvantage of being a single woman. She's operating with the advantage of being a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And we also know that enjoying the outdoors was an activity at that time period that was mainly a luxury of white Anglo-Saxon citizens.
And for decades after.
And I mean, we have an entire program on Cascade PBS Out and Back, which is about trying to diversify those who want to engage in outdoor activities, the kinds of things that and the kinds of places that Adelaide Pollock felt perfectly free to go.
Understanding that myself, my husband, my daughters, are all just happier outside. So it's why not go if we have access, right? And that's just what I want for more Black people.
And the Seattle Audubon Society, she was one of the founders of Seattle Audubon, but they've changed their name to Birds Connect Seattle because of the racial stigmas.
The Seattle chapter of the National Audubon Society has changed its name in an effort to cut ties with the slave owner the society is named after.
And I think that would be something that an Adelaide Pollock of a more recent era would probably be more sensitive to than the Adelaide Pollock of that era, who was trying to define citizenship within a more limited social order.
Was she well known in her time, or was she the bird lady? The slightly derogatory caricature as, the weird bird lady.
The newspaper references to the bird lady. She actually called herself Bird Woman in her book. There are a fair number of newspaper articles or references to her. I didn't really find an article that was sort of an appreciation of her until the 1940s. And there was a columnist in one of the newspapers who, would write columns about, historic figures you should know more about. And he wrote a column about her. I think it's interesting that she isn't better known. It's interesting there's not a school named after her. She apparently, she could really put up a fight. I found an article where the school district wanted to cut down trees right around West Queen Anne grade school. And Pollock manages to stop that, at least for the moment, with a very strong defense of, don't you dare cut these trees down. Well, one can imagine it's not only because of the bucolic atmosphere, but this is where the birds are, right? And they're coming to her school to cut these trees down. She had great courage. She wasn't just a bird lady who didn't have a purpose and a message and some toughness.
Was Adelaide Pollock fighting until the end? What year did she pass?
She died in, I believe, 1939, late 30s. We know in the 1930s is when she was writing her second book. I think her civic activities went right along. She was pretty old by the time she got to the late 1930s. She was living in the retirement community she had helped create. She had a friend on Vashon Island at Ellisport, which is near Maori Island. Yeah, she went over to visit her friend, and they went bird watching, and she suffered a stroke and died. So died doing what she loved.
Thanks for listening to Mossback. If you'd like to see all the episodes from this season of Mossback's Northwest, you can find them at cascadepbs.org. The video series is now in its 9th season. A new episode airs on Cascade PBS every Thursday night through May. This episode of Mossback was produced by Sarah Bernard. Our story editor and executive producer is Sarah Menzies. You can subscribe to the Mossback podcast wherever you listen, and whatever platform you're listening on, please review us. We'd love to know what you think of the show. And check out the show notes if you want to get in touch. Also, if you'd like to support the work we do, whether it's our lineup of podcasts, the video docuseries we stream every week, or the in-depth reporting we deliver every day, go to cascadepbs.org. In addition to supporting our journalism, members receive complete access to the on-demand programming of Cascade PBS. And being a member means you can sign up for an exclusive weekly Mossback Den newsletter from Knut Berger, where he offers greater insight into his latest historical discoveries. Mossback is a product of Cascade PBS. I'm Stephen Hegg. We'll be back soon with another episode.